Welcome to episode 26 of Posture Labs and Alignment Fundamentals. My name is Emma. Thank you so much for joining my YouTube channel and for joining this tutorial. In this series, we're going over basic alignment tips, tricks, and modifications for common yoga poses. In today's episode, we will be covering Hanumanasana and Ardha Hanumanasana, which is full splits and half splits. Now, to be completely honest with you, I can't do full splits. So I will explain how I will get into the pose and how someone who can do it should get into the pose, and do my best to demonstrate using some modifications that I'll share with you. Let this be a lesson that just because you're flexible in one way, I do have a lot of flexibility in other aspects. However, full splits, it's just not there for me. So if you're feeling that way too, it's totally okay. Doesn't mean you're doing it wrong, doesn't mean you're inflexible or bad at yoga. I love to use props in this pose. I like 2 blocks. If you've got them, grab them. If not, don't worry about it. We'll figure it out. Let's go over half splits first. So I like to get into half splits kind of from our low runner's lunge, like an Anjaneyasana position. I'm going to set up my blocks on either side of my mat and get into my low lunge. I'm making sure my right knee is stacked over my right ankle. I'm actually going to bring my blocks to the tall height and place my hands on the blocks. My left leg is extended long behind me with the top of the foot down. Now from here, I'm just going to shift my hips back and flex my right foot. I may need to walk my right foot more forward or my left knee more back. My goal is to stack my left hip over my left knee. Now from here, you kind of want to think about scissoring up the legs, so tugging the right hip back and driving the left hip forward. You might like to walk your blocks back a little bit or turn them down onto a smaller height. The goal is to fold over your right leg and feel a stretch through the back of your right leg. I'm going to flex my toes. Imagine pulling my right femur bone back towards my hip socket. I might start with a gentle bend in my knee. Now this is half splits, and I feel plenty of a stretch here. There's lots of variations you can do in half splits. You could take a twist with your left hand down, right arm reaching up. You could walk your hands over to the right. If you want to work your core, you could sweep your arms back. But for the purpose of this video, we're just going into a regular half splits. Now let's go ahead and see that on the other side. So I'll step my right knee back and my left foot forward into kind of my low lunge position. Then I'll shift my hips back and flex my left toes. I want to think about leading with my sternum. So I'm not rounding my back here. As I inhale, I pull my chest forward, shoulders back. As I exhale, folding over my left leg. I want to feel like my right hip is driving a little forward, my left hip is pulling back. All right, there shouldn't, but there is likely one side that's a little bit more flexible, a little bit easier, more comfortable than the other. For me, that's my right side, so I'm going to start there. Now, if I want to get into full splits, I'm actually just going to start in my half splits. My right leg is extended forward, so I'm going to start to wiggle my right foot forward. I'm still using my blocks, and maybe I start with those at the tall height again. So my right foot's wiggling forward. I'm getting a little bit more length here. Then I'm going to also bump my left knee back a bit. Now I like to keep my back toes tucked, kind of like to stop my body, just because I know I can't fully get into the pose. If you're someone who can easily get into splits, you're going to untuck your back toes so your body can just kind of melt into the pose. Now I'm flexing my front foot. As I flex my front foot, I'm contracting the muscles in the front of the leg. So like the quadricep muscle, that's actually going to help make the front of the leg shorter and lengthen the back of the leg. That's exactly what I want to do in my right leg at this point. I want to lengthen the calf muscle and the hamstring muscle. However, my back leg is doing the exact opposite, which is why I'm going to point the toes. As I point the toes, I'm lengthening the muscles in the front, so the quadricep muscles, and shortening the muscles on the back side, the hamstring muscles. So that's why I flex my front foot, point my back foot. Now I might turn my blocks down to a shorter height. I try to keep sitting up nice and tall. So I walk my blocks back kind of outside of my hips or outside of my right thigh. If I was someone who could easily get into full splits, I would start to fold over my right leg, kind of like how I was doing in a half splits, right? You can walk your hands forward. Just like in half splits, you're thinking of that scissoring motion with the legs. So you're kind of driving your left hip or your back hip a little bit forward and sucking your back or your front hip back. So pulling front hip back, back hip forward, like we would do in a revolved triangle or anything where we want the hips square. It's really easy for people here to fully extend the front leg and then kind of roll off to the side like I'm doing here. So this is obviously not a full splits. I'm gonna get way more benefit from doing a half splits than doing a full splits incorrectly. Best case scenario, I just don't get the stretch. Worst case scenario, I seriously injure myself or pull a hip flexor muscle, which has definitely happened to me before. So I would way rather see someone do half splits or something in between. I always like to say like 3/4 splits. This is where I feel a stretch, I feel I'm working, but I'm not gonna overstretch myself. Now, if I start to roll off to my right side, that's a good sign I need to back off a little bit. I wanna try to keep my hips as square as possible. My back foot, the toe should be pointing directly back, not sickling in or out. Let's try this on the other side, which for me is my much more inflexible side. I'm actually gonna show you facing forward so you can see what I mean with the hips. My left leg will start to walk forward and my right knee will slide back. Now for me, I can't go down as far on this side, but I'm still flexing my front foot and pointing my back toes. Now a lot of people will start to lean off to the left side here. So yes, you feel a lot of stretch in the back of the left leg, but now I'm really not evening out my hips. I wanna keep my hips as level as possible. That's why I like to use the blocks. If I don't use the blocks, I'm hinging forward a lot more and leaning off to one side a lot more because it's making it a little bit easier. So half of the stretch is the back of the front leg, so the back of the left leg, the hamstring, the calf. The other half of the stretch is the back leg, the hip flexor, the quadricep. So you don't just want to stretch the front leg. This is a full body, full leg pose. I want to stack my shoulders over my hips as much as possible. I want to keep the integrity of my hips, so right hip coming forward a bit, left hip pulling back, and then I'll come out of the pose. So this pose does require a bit of time to get into. If you're gonna practice splits, I recommend staying here for a little bit longer than like 3 breaths. You're not gonna get super far into the pose that way. If this pose is easy for you, again, you can walk your hands forward. You could even bend your back foot and reach back to grab it. That's if you're like super extra flexible. Maybe you're a dancer or you're hypermobile, and that's what you need to do to feel a stretch in your hip flexors. For the general public, we're gonna feel a stretch half splits, 3/4 splits, full splits, and not need to go anywhere else. Of course, do your best to maintain your breathing. It's really easy to hold the poses when things get challenging or uncomfortable. So do your best to breathe through this. And I think that's all I've got on half splits and full splits. I rarely practice full splits. I know I probably should because it's challenging for me. However, we all have those poses we just don't really like to do, right? If there's any other tips or tricks you have for half or full splits, make sure to leave those in the comments. I'm always open to learning something new. If you found this video helpful, make sure to give it a thumbs up. Hit the subscribe button to get updates on my channel. I release a new vinyasa class and a new posture lab every single week. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you next week.